Well, welcome everyone to the sixth faculty pub night of our 2018-2019 year. In the words of Timothy Snyder on Twitter this morning, we have an interdisciplinary doubleheader of a faculty pub night tonight. So before we get started, I'm just going to do a little bit of administrivia, and then we're going to hand it right off to our speakers. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is John Jackson. I'm the head of Outreach and Communications for the William H. Hannon Library, and on behalf of Dean Chris Brancalini, I want to welcome you to our faculty pub night. This is a series for those of you who may be new that we have to highlight the research and scholarly and creative works of the faculty here at LMU. We do 8 speakers every semester, and we try to do a wide, diverse range of faculty from across our colleges and departments. So this is a very laid-back atmosphere. If you'd like to grab some food during the event, you're welcome to just get up and grab some more food. It's called Faculty Pub Night, publication, but also pub as in pub atmosphere. For those of you, again, who are new, this is not just for faculty, and it's not just for people who are 21 and older, so students, tell your friends. And while I'm thinking about it, for the 2 people in the audience who might be students, I'm just guessing, if you need credit for this, for attending this event, let me know and I can swipe you in through Leo. And finally, you have feedback forms on your chairs, which Dean Brancalini is modeling for us. If you fill those out, you can be entered into a raffle for a $100 Amazon gift card. Finally, before I introduce our speakers, we do have copies of tonight's book available for sale. So at the end of tonight's event, if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, please see the table in the back and you can get a copy. All right, so tonight we have, like I said, a double header. We have Theresia de Vroom, Professor of English in LMU's Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts, and Michael Berg, Professor of Mathematics in the Frank R. Seaver College of Science and Engineering. And tonight they are going to be discussing their recent publication, The Past is a Foreign Country, 2 eyewitness accounts of life in the Japanese concentration camps in occupied Indonesia and the chaos that followed 1942 to 1949. So without any other ado, let me hand it over to our speakers.
Hello, is it good? Hello?
Hello?
It's okay, I can talk loudly.
They're both.
You want recording?
Oops, sorry. Is that working? I'm not sure. Yeah, I think so. Yes? Yeah.
Huh.
Oh, there we go.
Hello?
That works.
Hey.
Does this work?
Yes.
Yes, it
Okay,
does.
we're good.
That's good.
So Dr. de Vroom, Dr. Berg, Theresia, and Michael. Why don't you take it, Tisha?
Yes, so let's see. So Michael and I are both Dutch Indonesian, which means we're the last colonial babies born after the fall of the Dutch Empire in Indonesia. So I was actually born in Indonesia. Michael was born in Brazil, but conceived in Indonesia, we
Yes,
think.
indeed.
Well, we think.
This is a fact. We in fact, I was all prepared to be born in Indonesia, but we were thrown out. And so.
Yes, so it's an interesting narrative because, higher up, okay. It's an interesting narrative because we fit nowhere. And we're the last generation of people of our group that don't actually fit anywhere. So when you think of immigrants in other cultures, I think Mexican Americans, Salvadorian Americans, even Ethiopians, there's a culture that's part of the diaspora. Our group's gone. So we're the last ones, pretty much.
Our culture is, in a way, unique. The Dutch took over Indonesia around 1602, the Dutch East Indies Company. And Indonesia, of course, as you may know, is a remarkably rich country. Every imaginable mineral, it's incredible. And so the Dutch saw a phenomenal opportunity and colonized it for in the order of 300 years. And they put in place a hierarchy run by the Dutch themselves. And this brought about in the country of Indonesia a stratified society. So Theresia and I are of mixed blood. My ancestry is basically Prussian with a P, and French, and a lot of German also, and some Dutch. And my people made that our home for on the order of 4 generations. And so then, of course, the wars hit, World War II. And so what this book is about is what happened to our people, so mixed blood colonials, once the Japanese invaded the archipelago. So, go ahead.
And so many people don't know that Indonesia is bigger than America. Like it's a bigger space than America.
It's longer.
It has a longer, it has a bigger population. It's extremely diverse. It's extremely diverse religiously and all kind. Now there's a lot of Muslim input, but it was quite different in the days of colonialism. The Dutch were the only people that harnessed Indonesia, and they were there from 1602, which is a long time ago. They started the first, basically, corporation. I think the Jesuits were probably ahead of them, but that's basically it.
The Dutch East India Company.
The Dutch East India Company, and they made it possible for the Rajas and the people in control of the poor people to run a huge industrial complex in which they got rubber, tin, gold, you name it, they had it. Petroleum,
there
everything
are
else.
close parallels to the Raj, if you will.
Yeah.
Very similar, and it is still a fact to this day that the Dutch royal family's wealth is second only to that of Queen Elizabeth of England, and that wealth has been amassed almost entirely via, as I like to put it, exploitation of Indonesia. And so there it is.
Right, so, and there was then this group of people, so white men went over to Indonesia, they married, or not, they didn't marry, they had sex with, or slept with, or married Indonesian women, had mixed-race children, something then brought over their white wives, so that's another possibility. So that picture, that's my grandmother on the left, my two great-uncles, and my great-aunt. The two men were both killed in concentration camps. And so most Americans don't know that there was this incredible occupation of Indonesia. So the Japanese were, sadly or not sadly, frozen out of, they had no riches in terms of natural resources. They had no petroleum, they had no oil, they had no tin, they had no... Okay, so they started moving into Manchuria, into all kinds of places, and finally in World War II, like immediately, without a blink, they took Indonesia.
In fact, interestingly, when it all happened, around 41, my father was 17, I guess, 17. And he was drafted, and as were my uncles. And the Japanese were, of course, remarkably successful in their warfare, and the Dutch were remarkably quick in capitulating. And so, interestingly, my people had no idea that they had been defeated. But they were quickly taken, and my father was then shipped off to Burma, together with many of my mother's cousins, and he worked on the Burma Road, Burma Railroad, which is, of course, slave labor. It's pretty much a death sentence.
And most people don't know, we know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. 4 million Indonesians were killed on the Burma Road. So most people don't know that the numbers. And so the way the war in the Pacific is portrayed, in my opinion, is, and we wrote about this, is there's Okinawa and there's the stuff in Hawaii and blah, blah, blah. But nobody's paying any attention to what's going on in Indonesia. And the Japanese were very different from the Nazis. The Nazis kept records. So if you go to a concentration camp today, a memorial site in Germany, you can find the numbers. You can find your people. You cannot find your people anymore here. It's done.
My father, in fact, should have been dead twice. He contracted cerebral malaria, which is pretty much a death sentence. And a Catholic priest actually saved his life. My father was given up for dead. And his possessions had been taken. His shoes were gone. All he had left was a loincloth. He had been a lumberjack, but he was clearly dying. And so the priest said to my father, "So, you have no interest in seeing your family again?" His family were in a prisoners' concentration camp, citizens' concentration camp on Java, as were my mother and her younger brother and her mother and her father. Her father at this point had been killed, my grandfather, by the Japanese because he had been in fact, if I may, that is a picture of my grandfather on the left. And he was he was tortured to death by the Japanese. He had been a resistance fighter, a saboteur. They captured him. In fact, he was betrayed by a neighbor, an Indonesian neighbor. This is interesting in its own way. the Indonesians themselves, the native Indonesians, had been quickly turned by the Japanese into enemies of their previous colonial masters, as it were. And so my grandfather, who was actually not all that wealthy, had been betrayed, and then, because he was a saboteur, was tortured to death.
And so just to say that the Japanese told the Indonesians that we're all Asians and we're Asians for Asia, which was, excuse me, bullshit, because the Japanese had no respect for the Indonesians. And so what they did was they used them. And so they used these poor people who were brown and who were not to co-opt them into this project, which then turned them against, and rightfully so perhaps, their colonial masters, except that our group was cut in the between. So our group, if you look at that picture, we should go back to your family and go to another one, but you can tell that you look at these people and you think, okay, they look like, maybe to you they look like something Oriental or whatever, or Indonesian or Asian, but in fact they were raised Christian, they spoke Dutch as their first language, they also spoke, as my family did, Bahasa Indonesian, as I did, but they were caught between. So the Indonesians hated them, the Dutch hated them.
So that picture, this is my family. Again, my grandfather, the man who was tortured to death, and my grandmother on the left. My mother is the young girl on the lower right. Next to her right, is my uncle, her younger uncle. And those three rather, were in a citizens' camp on Java. In the back is my older uncle, who was 16 when the war hit. He lied about his age and joined the military, and he ended up in Burma with my father. They didn't know each other at the time, but of course later on they would. They both survived. He survived black water fever. Now, at the end of World War II, when the Japanese had begun to lose quickly, a categorical order was given that all the prisoners of war were to be executed. So I don't know what the status was of my uncle, but my father was slated to be buried in a mass grave. He was working on a road, the railroad in fact, underneath a promontory, so it was a ravine overhanging where he was working. At this point, Hiroshima and Nagasaki occurred. The war ended, and they found dynamite charges along the ravine to bury the prisoners alive by the ravine collapsing on them.
And so a lot of people, we talk about, and I would say that nuclear bombs are a terrible thing, horrific thing, but a lot of people of that generation, their lives were saved, they thought, by not having been buried alive, including some of my family. Yes. So that it's an interesting, both sides of the story. Certainly.
And at the same time this was happening, of course, so my father, after that, was liberated by the Americans. My mother was liberated by the English. So it took him a year after he gained his freedom to make his way back from Burma through Thailand, or Siam, to Indonesia, because the Dutch provided no transport. He had a bum ride and eventually got one. At this point, my mother and her family had been liberated from a camp, a concentration camp, and this was a peculiar affair. As we get to the story in the book that this is from, that we're featuring tonight, at one point the Japanese lost. It was clear that they were losing, and they left. And so my people were left in this camp, no guards anymore. They were in the middle of the jungle. They had nowhere to go. The fact the Japanese located these camps in dreadful places, so there was no need for two-flight security, because if you would take off, you would die in the jungle.
And so jungles are, bad to be probably in Poland in a concentration camp, but jungles are very particular, because if you cut your foot or if you do anything, you're dead. And so these are people who are in slave labor camps, and that's my grandfather died just out of starvation. So why don't we do the next slide? What do we have next? I'm not sure. This is what's left of my grandfather. This is what he rolled his cigarettes with, which were Kretek, which is the clove cigarettes, and the buttons of his jacket.
Not always cloves.
Not always cloves, exactly.
My grandmother rolled tobacco cigarettes for my grandfather.
Yeah.
So nothing untoward. Yeah.
Should we do the next one?
Sure.
Yeah, so my mom's family was upper middle class. They lost absolutely everything.
So
I still own this, and this is a coconut shell, and they made their money to stay alive by making artifacts for the Japanese soldiers to sell and give to their prostitutes. And this is a powder box to put powder and condiments and things in, and it's a photograph of that that our friend here, Madeline, took, and the other one as well, to keep them alive. They were locked in. My mother and her 3 sisters were not in a concentration camp, but they were locked in a house for 4 years, basically.
So
What's the next one?
this is Java, and so you'll see Jakarta. In those days, it was called Batavia, and then Bandung. That's where my mother is from, and Surabaya is where my father is from. So those 3, and it's a gargantuan island.
And these are the map of all the concentration camps, which, again, most
Well,
Americans...
only a few.
Only a few,
There are many more.
Many more, yeah. You want to do the next one?
Sorry?
The stars.
Yeah.
Definitely by the stars.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Okay, so this is a great little story. And I'm sorry that this guy's not here tonight, but Judy Stanton, who is an alum of LMU, Marymount College. So if you look at the right-hand picture, you see this, what you would think is a nice white boy, okay, with his little hair and everything else. But that's his family on the left. So what happens, as you may know from mixed-race families, people turn out white, or they turn out brown, or they turn out in the middle of the family, whatever. And so this guy, he's not here, so I can say this honestly. So he came to see us. And he's the husband, he's 80-something, and he was in the children's camp. So they had women's camps, men's camps. The children until 11 stayed with the women. Once they turned 11, they went to the men's camps. That's in his induction statement on the right-hand side. He came to see us 5 times. I interviewed him 5 times. I did not like him. I just have to tell you.
Well, if I may, he actually caused me, to lose my temper.
No, he was not very...
He was in a camp named Cimahi.
Yeah. Well, as my grandfather was too, yeah.
The top right stamp, it's a jongenskamp, which means boys' camp.
Yeah.
Stichting, which means actually organization.
Organization.
And
Yeah.
Cimahi is the camp. So my mom was in a camp named Cicak Lobak, which was this Indonesian phrase. And so when I mentioned that to him, he claimed that the camp didn't exist. Now imagine being the son of a survivor of a concentration camp, being told by some jackass that his father's experience is false. If he wasn't an old man, I might have said more, not that I'm so young, but he's much older than I might have been more, shall we say, pointed with what I said to him.
And so the interesting thing is about our culture.
The fact is, of course, that he spent a lot of time arguing with us about our experience. And then as Theresia prodded him more and more, it turned out that he was also in profound denial about his own experience.
Completely. So he said things to us like, oh, it was fun, and I was a kid, and I was running around, and we were eating snails, and it was really cool, and I wasn't around my parents, and all this stuff. And it took me 5 interviews with this guy, and I still don't like him, and I don't like it today, but I wrote a piece for him, and if you show the next slide, I hope that's the next slide, he showed up finally, interview 5, with this. And what this is, the broken part on the right, he brought to me, when you get medicine from the prescription, and it's in that little orange bottle. He brought that in, and I said, what's that? And he said, that's Mickey Mouse. And so we looked it up online, and it's the old Mickey Mouse. And I said, what is that? He said, well, this is what I went to sleep with every night in the concentration camp next to my bed, and I made a little bed for him, and he slept next to me, and I've never parted with him. And I said, well, what does that mean to you? And this guy would not say one word to us about anything that really happened. And he said, that's my conscience.
And despite the fact that he's not one of my favorite people either, I can certainly understand his state of denial. I mean, in our culture, and this, by the way, is one of the main reasons why we're so keen on doing this. It's not a pleasant experience, obviously, to go back to this. But one of our dearest friends, God rest his soul, Phil Dorn, he was in on this from the beginning. He and I played for Theresia's Institute. And as a Jew, I had a marvelous resonance with him, because we're talking about death camps, concentration camps. And so we have been, we're the survivors of a Holocaust experience, as is Phil. As are, the Jews, of course, very wisely don't forget this. My people have a different ethos. Our people have a superstition, as it were. Don't talk about it lest it recur.
Yeah, so my mother died a year and a half ago. Your mother's still alive. I could not get a word out of my mother. Not a word about what happened. Not a word. And so, unlike any number of immigrant experiences, any number of concentration camp experiences, the Armenians, the Jews, whoever, our culture is, and you wouldn't know it. I mean, I have colleagues that have said to me, I had no idea. I was like, oh, hello. And, my first 3 languages were not English. I mean, they had no idea because we fit in. You wouldn't know.
Oh, but that's also the consequence of coming from our culture, because even as colonials living there for generations, we thought we fit in. My father, I remember him saying that when after the war, when the Civil War struck the islands, when the Japanese took off, there were no soldiers around. There was just young men, old men, and women and children. And at this point, the Indonesians attacked in brutal ways the remaining population. And so my father came back, as I say, after a while, to the archipelago. My uncles were back, and a bloody civil war erupted for years and years. And what happened was, and this is after the war, I was born in 1955, and so there were still remnants of this going on. In fact, shortly before that, there was still violence in the streets. Now, in these 2 major actions, the militia that had been formed, in fact, defeated the terrorists, the insurgents, and they actually, the Indonesian uprising, involved attacks on the population that were absolutely draconian. I'll spare you the details. But when our people came back, of course, war was waged. Well, at the end of this, the Dutch, who still had control of the islands, granted official independence to the Indonesians. So my people, Theresia's people, the victors, instantaneously became the vanquished. And this is why, when my mother was pregnant with me in 1955, we were given 2 weeks to leave the country, because my father's war record was too well known by the government. My uncle Eddie was given 2 days. That's how bad this was. And so my father said years later, they made a mistake. They should have somehow managed to make peace and stay in their home country. Because now our people were set free, as it were, into cultures where we had no business. I lived in Holland for 5 years. I felt like a total alien there. I was born in Brazil. I felt at home in Brazil. But am I Brazilian? Not really. I feel like an American. I identify as an American completely. I feel totally at home here now. Except there are these traces that are unique, and in a way, they leave the scars that won't go away.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I think it's an odd thing to feel, and maybe some of you feel this way too, but to not feel like you have a home, that you don't belong someplace. And both of us, certainly why this book was so hard, was that it's about being homeless.
Well, it's interesting. It took Theresia 2 weeks.
No, 2 months.
Longer? Well, she has a better sense of time than I have. I didn't want to do it for a variety of reasons. One of the primary being that I was afraid that my mother, who is now 91, would get hit by this whole affair as like a runaway freight train. To my amazement, she embraced the whole thing, and it was a catharsis. So she has copies of the book. She sent it to her friends in the Netherlands, all over the world, so I was amazed,
So
and I'm extremely happy about
let's
that.
do the next slide, maybe. So what are we doing? So what we did was 2 things happened. So this is the first translation. I'll talk about it. So I found the way this started is that I found in my parents' papers a book published in 1946 called Mein Kampf, Not by Hitler, which is not this. and it is my camp, meaning concentration camp, not by Hitler. So I talked to Michael and said, let's translate this, and it's in 5 languages. Your mom helped, my mom helped, because it's Indonesian, Japanese, blah, blah, blah. It's got everything in it, English, everything else. But before that happened, I talked to a man who is involved in this whole project, somehow complicated, and I said, have you seen this? And he said, well, I have a book too. And so he sent us this book, which we're just showing a few images, which was done by a kid who then I think did it as an adult. Wait, go back one more. Who did it as an adult?
Track slowly.
Sorry, I won't go back. And in New Zealand, but he was a child in a concentration camp. And so what it does is, if you know about Anne Frank and all that stuff, the reason Anne Frank is possible and probable is for many reasons, but also because she was young. There's so few accounts of young people writing about concentration camps. So this is children, even though they don't look like children, hauling the trash out, and this is a very heavy... so this guy wrote this thing, did it in color crayons. We cleaned the whole thing up. I have the original manuscript. And this is children hauling the trash out. If you do the next one. So this is corroboration of a lot of things. This is called the bottom scrapers. So when they did the meals and there was leftover food, the really young kids who didn't have any food scraped the bottom of the barrel.
And notice also the ribs showing on these kids.
So the calorie intake was under 800 calories. Okay, and here's, so then he writes in English, this is a humiliation exercise. So they were out doing something like, God knows what they did, and they would shave their heads, just that they did in the Nazi concentration camps, and then walk them through, and then they were not allowed to eat, and this was their punishment. Want to do the next one? So these are the color ones. Then this is the one. Book. This is the other book. So the second book, we've got hundreds of images. I mean, if you want the book, if you can afford it, buy it. If you can't, just take one. But this is a really great thing. So this is in Dutch. So we did the Dutch on the left. The right is, and this is they're peeing into vats. Okay. So they're peeing into vats, and we actually tracked down the guy, the chemist, who figured this out, which is that if you don't eat B12 or whatever it is, you die really quickly. Yeah. So what they figured out is how to turn urine into yeast for the bread so that they would not die. So this basically says, do your duty, pee in this vat, and we will make bread for you.
It says, think about the yeast factory. It says, at 8 o'clock in the morning, there have to be produced at least 2 containers full, otherwise tomorrow there will be no bread.
So, and again, it was, and we found the guy. We tracked him down. I mean, it was amazing that happened, but we found him, and who was the chemist who figured this out, that they could make yeast out of urine. Want to do the next one? So this is the cartoon book.
Oh, yeah.
This is, again, bottom scrapers. So this is the last run. So you can see it's in many languages, right? And how skinny they are. And most people, my grandfather died of starvation.
If I may make one comment here. When I was translating this from Dutch into English, I tried to translate in keeping with how the author wrote the Old Dutch. Yeah. And this is interesting. It was clear from the way he wrote that he was reasonably educated and wanted to show that he was. So he would pun in different languages. He would throw in English, throw in some Latin, throw in allusions to Plato and Socrates and so forth. And when I first translated it, Professor de Vroom, professor of English, pointed out that I was out of my mind because it read horribly. And so then Theresia gave it the idiomatic fix. And so now we tried very much, and I think she succeeded, obviously, to convey the sense of what he was saying. But the dialects are no longer in existence. So that made it entertaining. And ironically, the only people who can still do this, of course, are people such as Theresia and myself, the last remaining few, who still speak the dialect. So when I speak Dutch at home, with my mother, I speak it absolutely fluently. But it's like an Australian speaking English.
Yeah, it's even worse than
the Dutch knew right away that I wasn't.
Yeah, well, that's how we met. We'll tell that story in a little bit. Okay, now let's do the next one. This is a torture.
This is a great pun, by the way.
Go ahead.
It says leiders na de conferentie met de Jappen.
Yeah.
Leider, the first word, it means both leader and sufferer, depending on how you spell it. In Dutch, there are two ways to put together the consonant, the first consonant in the word there. And so leider means two
To
things.
suffer.
Lead as well as suffer. And it means worse than suffer. It really means suffer badly. Suffer chronically.
So this is about being tortured because you're a leader and you're standing up for other people. And I mean, I always tell the story when the LA riots happened, Michael Berg's family were in Inglewood.
No, we were in
Manhattan Beach, and you went to go see your dad.
I couldn't go see them afterwards, so I couldn't see them for days. So I finally made my way to my parents' house, thinking, of course, these old folks would be in a state of panic. My father was sitting, as he usually used to do, in the backyard, looking at the sun, enjoying himself. And my mom was watering the garden. And so I asked them, what's going on here? I thought you guys would be scared. And my mother said, oh no, we survived the war. And Papa just smiled at me.
Well, actually, they said, which my parents, and it's not very racist, but sorry, but they would say, "I survived the Jap," which is what they would say, and that I'm sorry, it's because it's a bad thing to say, but they would say that because they were tortured. So it's what it is. What's the next one we have? Are we almost? This is Family's Hope. So you see, it's in English, even in the original, and this is the child cooking. So the children were put in the camps. And then
You see again by the child's body, it might as well be Dachau or Auschwitz.
Yeah. And most, again, what's astounding to both of us, because we lived through this our entire lives, and the PTSD from this, and our families who never recovered.
My father died in 2004. He was 80 years old. And throughout his life, we became states in 68, like I say. If it would rain in Manhattan Beach, in one of the most beautiful cities in the country, my father would awaken at night in a panic because he thought in his dreams and his nightmares he was once again in Burma during the monsoon. Then it would clear, then he would calm down.
And then my father, their family had Jews in Holland. His brother was executed in front of him for doing that. And never talked about it till I was, I think, 35 or 40. And then also, was sent out. He was shipped out. So the young Dutch after the war were shipped out to fight what's called the Bersiap, which was the time of the mercenary, the young Indonesians rising up against the civil war, against the Dutch, which, we get that. But who killed a whole bunch of other people in my family. And my father never recovered from killing Indonesians. So there's that little piece too. So he would have nightmares, I think, every night about what he had done and didn't have wanted to do.
It leaves a mark on you. I mean, I was raised in the Netherlands from when I was 7 till 13 as a colonial kid. So again, the parallel might be Aussies in England, but I had nothing but, well, not fear. It was more worry, to be on your guard, whether they were Dutch kids or Indonesian kids, because both of them had been threats. And so I was raised that way. So it takes a while to get over that.
And again, it's this weird thing. Like in America, we just pass. Like nobody gets it. Like we met each other because we knew immediately that we were the same group.
Because the dialect, the accent.
Yeah, but we just pass and nobody knows.
You should tell that story.
Well, the story is that Kofelbach, who was the head of the Jesuits for a long time, came and at LMU years ago when we were first here, and all the Dutch people were invited, and you were standing in line, and you and I were together back in line.
Theresia was talking to, I think, the father Kolfenbach.
In Dutch.
And I was had my back turned, and I heard the accent. And it's like I say, it's like an Aussie. Hearing another Aussie.
Well, it's like a southern, it's like a southern accent. It's different, it's softer than the Dutch. So.
And so I knew right away, it's a sister.
Okay, let's do the next one, and we're almost done with you guys. You're all done.
Oh, yes.
This is the open door politic. This is the story of pooping dysentery, which is really dangerous.
Malaria.
So they wore malaria. They wore these little clogs, which they still have, which are wood with like a little rubber banner thing, and there was no place to poop, and how disgusting the toilet situation was.
And think of the contagion. I mean, this is dysentery.
Typhus, yeah.
One more?
Yeah, I think we have one more.
Ah.
This is my aunt, who I'm named after, and that was right before the war. She wrote a piece for the book, it took a lot to get out of her, but I did get something out of her too. Her name is my name too. What else do we? Is that it? And that's my family. So my mother's on the right, and those are the sisters, and that's before the war.
That's, oh my
And
gosh.
go ahead, you tell that story.
My mother, my grandmother, my two uncles, and so they were wearing the militia outfits that my uncles wore when they were respectively with the Anginica and the Gajamera. Those were the two militias that fought against the terrorists. And so my uncle was on the left was all of 18. My uncle on the right was maybe 22. My mother, on the left, of course. What's interesting is to do a contrast. Look at those faces.
Yeah.
You can tell, contrasting it with how it was before the war, that there's such tragedy there. And as you can tell, I mean, this is probably the hardest photo for me to look at of all of them. My mother is still, she's 91 now, and so anyway, enough said about that.
And I do we have one more? I don't know if you have anything else that we're done. Oh yeah, we'll come back to that. That's my family in Holland before the war. Do we have one more? I'm not sure. That's good. So, and I'll just tell this one story about Michael. So Michael's this like hard-ass math teacher, tough, does Asian martial arts, does all kinds of stuff, doesn't take any bullshit. And then when we were done with the translation, I said, all right, now we have to do the research. And he said, I'm not doing it. And it wasn't because he was lazy. It's because he couldn't face it. So I spent a year reading about hell ships and how you torture people and how many calories and what you do and how it works and everything else. And it was really, really hard, jerk, and wrote it up. But it's just interesting that information is just not out there, and how hard it has been for both of us. I mean, I'm glad we did the book, but I don't want to do it again. That's for sure. Yeah, and you don't either.
I said to my colleagues this afternoon at the apartment, why am I wearing a tie? They thought I had some sort of job interview. So I said that I was going to do this, and then I mentioned that this makes me more tired psychologically and emotionally than my PhD defense. I'd rather do that again than this. I mean, this is... But Theresia made this excellent point, and my dear friend Phil amplified it, that this story has to be told. And so, God willing, what we're doing with this book can raise consciousnesses and awareness about this other Holocaust. So that's why we did it.
And a good movie if you have nothing to do.
Oh,
There's
gosh.
a great movie called Railway Man that nobody
yeah.
saw, which Nicole Kidman is in, and I
Colin
think...
Firth.
Colin Firth.
It's
Nobody
brilliant.
saw it. It's quite good, and almost no one saw it, but it's quite good, and it's a little bit about what this was about.
And that is precisely the experience that we...
Yeah.
Theresia, after Twisting My Arm for another so many weeks, talked me into getting the movie, and I watched it, and it hit, again, that hard. But it's an incredible story, and it's much of it is my father. So, yeah.
Yeah, good. Thank you so much all for coming up.
Do we have questions from the audience? We've got time.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
I was just wondering what the catalyst was for you to tell the story now. Was there a precipitating event?
Yeah, I think that one precipitating issue. Well, first I found that manuscript. Second of all, another manuscript. Then everybody's dying.
Yeah.
And so the group of people that even are Dutch Indonesian, like in Holland now, or there are a lot of them in California and stuff, they're not connected to the culture. They're just not. And so we thought that what we could do is tell this story now. And my mom just died, your dad died, your mom's older. So we thought a lot about keeping, and then I just think it was like something nobody's telling this story. It was like, hello, it should be told. And I did not want to do it. I really didn't, and he didn't, for the same reasons of what we grew up with. It was like we were taught not to talk about it. So I think that the catalyst was really to keep the story alive, and then try to get people involved. And as I said, the guy that we interviewed about Mickey Mouse, he wasn't going to tell a story either, but we finally got him to do it. So I think, Elias does this all the time with the Ethiopian heritage. Somebody's got to tell the story. And if you don't tell the story is dead. And there's not a lot written. There's some stuff, but there's not a lot written, and there's not a lot that's truthfully written, I think.
And if I'd like to add something to this, when Theresia finally convinced me to do it, and I did it, the experience of doing those translations day after day was harrowing, but it was meaningful at a very deep level because it actually stirred things in me that had been hidden for a long, long time, and they were brought to light. And sharing this with she's more of a sister than anything else, anyhow, with my baby sister here. And
6 months younger, don't worry.
but so much wiser than I am. So, but and also, like I say, from my family, my younger brother also was involved in this to some extent, and it was a unique experience, not an easy one by any stretch of the imagination, but a necessary one.
And I think, I can't speak, well, I can speak. Our parents were
You
nuts.
usually do.
Our parents were nuts. Our parents went through hell, and they never assimilated. They never got it. They were never connected. So there's that little piece, which is interesting. Like, I feel like you've been through hell with Ethiopia, but you've got an Ethiopian community. We had a community that didn't talk, that was just like PTSD out the wazoo. Both of our parents.
And the community itself was stratified, because when we ended up, say, in the Netherlands, where most colonials ended up, the same stratification occurred there that had been in place in Indonesia. And so that culture is defined, the colonial structure, as a function of how much pigment you have. And so,
you may not know what we are, but I remember Linda Bannister, my dear colleague, said to me, with my brother, he's dead now, looked like he was Mexican. He was dark, he had an afro, he was big, and she said to me, I didn't know, I thought one of you must have been adopted.
Yeah. Well, the photos earlier of my two uncles, one of them was much darker. Everyone was convinced he was either Polynesian or Portuguese.
Yeah. And once you're dark or look Chinese, you're dead in the water.
Parenthetically, when I went to Holland because of my mixed race, the Dutch actually thought that I was Japanese.
And so, and that's the thing also, like, you can't tell from us, but when my mom would go to Holland, my dad's white, he would get waited on before her.
Oh, yeah.
They know exactly that I'm not one of them. Even though my Dutch is fluent, your Dutch is fluent, they know exactly, boom, you're not one of them. And so it's a really weird place of not belonging in some ways. Barbara, you were going to ask something.
Well, I just want to thank you for a very generous talk. I can only imagine what it must have been to put it together and then to be talking about it and sharing such difficult moments. As you were talking, I was thinking about the question of the ways in which we approach PTSD, the ways in which we talk about art therapy, and the ways in which we look at that whole issue of hybridity. And it seemed to me perfect for perhaps a small enough seminar, and I'm just sort of wondering in terms of future if you're thinking about, if there might be some book adoptions among small specialized groups such as professionals in the area, with a sense of the importance of the testimonial. And I was just wondering if that was something, or if this is something where one tells the story, and the telling of the story it closes the circle, and the audience is restricted to those in the circle.
I don't think the circle closes, to be honest. I certainly still have effects in my own life that are a consequence of my parents' PTSD. I have it to an extent. There are certain things that trigger me to this day that are clearly an indication. I'm not sure, Barbara, that the circle actually closes in that sense. Maybe I'm misunderstanding you, but I think the giving airplay to all this is important because it's therapeutic for us. And certainly, yeah.
This venue, a completely different view from, say, textbook, PTSD, definition, ideology, all of those kinds of things, and not that other things haven't, but the complexity of the issue from so many perspectives is very, very rich.
Yeah, I mean, I'm doing the Bellarmine Forum this year, so in my course, the two of us gave a presentation to my class, and they were really kind of moved by it, and they got it. So trying to keep it out there and see what happens. And again, the books are on sale, but if you can't afford one, just take one. And thank you for coming. I know it's late at night, and it's what it is. But thank you so much for coming, huh?
Thank you for
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just from on